I kind of get a little bit uh, anxious around analogy talk.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so,
What,
and
what
I
do you
didn't,
think? What do you think an analogy is?
if I take it as, I think there's about six different types that I've counted. But if I take it as Shavara, I would take it as much more of an apophatic bent, an ever greater dissimilarity, a
Yeah, no,
laddering
I'm
forward.
translating Shavar. I'm not a.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah. I can't believe that you translate some of the things you said about Bulgakov and the sociologists. But
It's a text that is
yeah, no,
seminal for a lot of 20th century
yeah,
systematic theology, and since there it's
yeah.
it's
Oh,
even theological students who are competent in German would find his German rather daunting, and so it's important to, it's
yeah,
brilliant and it's
yeah.
problematic. Yeah.
No question. Everyone should read it. Um, the question I have, though, is for me, it was a little bit unsuspecting, but it was through studying Maximus that I came to have a problem with analogy, which seems to be
Yeah.
counterintuitive. Because it seems to me that what you're saying of the Gnostics, the sort of extreme transcendence of the one first principle, which never gets, as it were, its
Yeah.
hands dirty and isn't caught up in some theogonic process through this world, which is basically a string of tragedy and sacrifice. That I think is correct historically. I think you're completely right. I think you're right that this, therefore, to slap that label on someone like the idealist is not only wrong, but actually almost completely wrong. So I think all that is great. Question I have is, it seems to me that especially by the time you get to say the Theopascite, Neo-Chalcedonian sort of centuries, you actually get both at once.
Right.
That is to say, you get the one right in Christ identifying himself to the point where you chant, God, the crucified God, or the God suffering God, the life-giving flesh of Christ in this. So you have something like, and as you know, Maximus presses constantly, incessantly upon identity, which is the thing that Shavara and Balthazar and all of them, of course, rule out in principle in terms of what's able to be said from an analogical perspective. And yet, at the same time, my reading, at least, as you know, is that it's actually because of the conviction that the highest God was crucified that actually gives rise to the provisional dualism, or makes sense of it, that you rightly detect the New Testament, the Gnostics, and so forth. So, in other words, I don't, is there a way, and I would want to read Hegel this way. I don't really want to get
Good.
into like a exegetical issue over Hegel, as you say, you can read him every which way. But is there at least a possibility, or what would you think of affirming both that God is, as you say, incarnating into all things, as Maximus says, and you agree with, such that there must be identity between, say, the true history, the true creation, the true world, and that actually entails the destruction of the false dualism that we generate, right? All of these things, it seems to be that it's not analogy necessarily as some sort of kind of more abstract placeholder, which safeguards against uh, maybe certain troubling trends in the idealists, but it's actually a Christological identity which opposes. So you can actually say that because God makes himself identical with the world in the Word, that he does not simply develop through the slaughterhouse of history, because he overcomes that history in his identification with that history. Is this the sort of thing that you would?
Yeah, but I mean, I think you're worrying too much about analogy in the sense that you're thinking of the actual interval of analogy as a pure disjunction. It's not. An analogy is a unity that is different in aspect according to which side of the analogy is given priority, but that ultimately is not a disjunction or even an opposition. Certainly not an antithesis, right? I mean, you'd grant that. You can't have an analogy between two things that are in fact antithetic. Analogy simply know, um, is to say that there is a, a unity between the way in which in God all possibility is actual, say, just to give you an example. Everything
Mm.
possible is actual. And the way in which in the actuality of creation there's a real collapse of possibility into finite actuality, and therefore you're looking at a participatory unity. And when I say unity, I mean unity. I don't mean participation in the sense of something that is other than God in any but a modal way.
Mm.
I'm going to get excommunicated if I keep going on here. But analogy, is simply pointing to different modalities within a unity. That's different from either opposition or simple identity that does not allow for the kind of distinction that you seem willing to preserve, between the true story and the false story, and the way in which we are integrated into the true story. Now I'm sounding more Jensenian than I mean to, or more Yale School than I mean to.
And it's good.
But, at the end of the day, I'm a monist, as any sane person is. We can play games with it, but any metaphysics that is coherent is ultimately reducible to a monism. And since you've read the book Your Gods, you know how it starts. It argues that nothing can become anything that it isn't already.
Mm.
And so God, not that God becoming man is actually a metaphysis isarogenos, but even so, God does not become a man. That's obvious in a way that it somehow alters who he is. Nothing that is in a man is excluded from who God already is. But in the same way, we cannot become partakers of the divine nature unless we are already fully partakers of the fullness of the divine nature. And between, that understood as the dynamism of possibility and actuality from this end of spiritual perception, spiritual life, from this far removed end of the ordo cognoscendi, if you prefer. I don't remember how that sentence began, so I don't know what comes after the comma here. What was the first preposition I used? Anyway, from the other end, so to speak, the ordo ascendi, the fullness of God, that dynamism, what is for us the dynamism of the possible and the actual, is a full, genuine manifestation and participation in that infinite actuality that's God. I'm not sure how analogy here is a problem for you. I just think that if you don't want to use that word, you don't have to. You do, however, have to acknowledge that there's a modal distinction between being Jordan Wood and being God the Father. At least a modal distinction.
I think there's a modal distinction, but there's also a difference between a personal modal distinction and an essential one. Because, of course, the Father isn't the Son, and yet that actually means that they're infinitely identical in essence.
But then again, there's, in that sense, you can speak of analogy of Father and Son in the Trinity. It doesn't indicate a disjunction. Of course you can, because the Son is the fullness of the Father reflected, right? He is the fullness of the depth of the paternal arche, but not in the mode of the Father.
Yes.
So, however you want to define analogy, the point of the analogia entis, remember, and this is where you have to appreciate Shavara, is that his claim is not that there are two distinct, separate realities that are held together in a neutral medium called existence or being, but that rather the one reality of being, which is fullness in God and a dynamism in us, is expressed in these radically different and yet utterly, intimately inseparable ways. um, the analogy there is not a gulf. It is a union under the form of a distinction, but not of a separation, like the divine and the human natures of Christ. But I'm quite content for you to use the Christological language instead. If you want to throw the word analogy out, you can, because it's a vague word.
Yeah.
And again, among those arid, hopeless Thomists of whom I spoke, the manualist Thomists, it becomes quite a desiccating category of linguistic attribution, and ultimately dissolves into a kind of useless apophaticism, one that's not enveloped in a deeper
So
gnosis.
far, so good.
Apophaticism, it should not be understood as the defeat of gnosis by agnosia, but the defeat of episteme
Yeah.
by gnosis, right?
Right. Put in a German context, it would be the defeat of Verstand for the sake of
Right.
Vernunft.